Hey guys, in today's player requested video, I am going to be going over and describing as best I can the differences between generations of the first Strike T15. Now, the T15's been out in the market, I think, since 2014, give or take. Pretty sure it's 2014. And there's been 5 generations during its availability. All right, now, believe it or not, this isn't just a mess of parts on the tech mat. Well, it kind of is, but there's a method to my madness. All right, I've tried to break down each generation into a column of parts. So Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5. All right, each gen shows the difference in parts and what changed per generation. So instead of starting off at Gen 1, because that's our basically baseline, I'm going to go to Gen 2 and compare it to Gen 1, and then go to Gen 3 and compare it to Gen 1, and so on and so forth. All right, so less babble, more talk. Here we go. Bolt sleeves. Changes. Gen 1, Gen 2. Okay. Changes to it was the hole that your screw goes into is no longer tapered. In Gen 1 it was tapered, Gen 2 it wasn't. Okay. Now the reason for that was because the Gen 1 sleeve used a tapered head screw that sat in that hole. Now, what would happen over time and through the vibration of the marker cycling is that typically the screw would work itself loose and then get caught or snagged up on the bolt as it cycled and would bend. And the bent screw, even it was only like quite literally probably a 0.5 millimeter bend, was enough to allow the bolt sleeve to get out of alignment and basically leak air out of your upper receiver. Now, until the Gen 2 bolt sleeve was available, the only fix was take your bent screw out, replace it with another one, put some Loctite on it, and hope for the best. But the fix wound up being a new bolt sleeve that had a bigger screw hole and a new fastening system. So they started using a socket head type screw, okay? And they used a cup seal or a aluminum cup that basically the screw would go into and then screw into the upper receiver and basically hold the bolt sleeve in place. Didn't allow for any kind of play, and it actually really did hold the bolt sleeve very securely. Okay, that was one change. Next, let's do the upper manifold. Gen 1, Gen 2 to current, okay? Well, not current, because anyways, all right. So, you can see in the Gen 1 upper manifold, it was just a regular O-ring that was bent into place into the groove to form its shape. Problem with that was, and you can even see it here, that O-ring never really wanted to sit in the grooves very well at all, okay? So their fix for it was to make their own O-ring for their upper manifold. And that O-ring had a little crossbar that would wind up sitting in its own groove and kind of act like an anchor and held the actual O-ring in place. But that also in turn wound up benefiting the air efficiency of the marker somewhat. Actually, not really somewhat, just a little bit. Enough to notice, but not enough to make a difference, if that makes sense. All right. Either way, it was a, well appreciated upgrade because this O-ring doesn't really pop out on its own at all anymore compared to that first gen guy. Okay. Next, let's do this guy. Cross pins. These are the cross pins that hold in your trigger assembly and your valve pin system. This is the Gen 1 version. It used a C-clamp sort of locking system on one end, where the newer generations wound up incorporating a spring-loaded ball bearing locking mechanism. I mean, my personal opinion, love these guys. Way easier to install and remove. These guys were and are somewhat cumbersome and a pain in the butt. All right. Next up, let's do valve pin. Valve pin got redesigned, okay, and changed. So, again, Gen 1, Gen 2. The Gen 1 guy wound up having sort of a cliff top. Hopefully you can see that. And was made of a little bit of a softer material, where this newer generation valve pin, it has a tapered top to it and is made of a metal that's a little bit more robust. The reason being this, or why this got changed was in the Gen 1 markers, this valve pin, because of the sharp edge on the top, combined with another thing, which I'll show you in a minute, wound up getting caught during the cycle of the marker or of the bolt, and the bolt would shear off that ball bearing on top, and that ball bearing would wind up going loose in your upper receiver, basically causing a muck and damaging bulkheads, bulkheads, and yeah, it was not good times, right? So they redesigned the valve pin to what you see here. It was a good improvement. It definitely has helped. All right. Combined with that whole valve pin thing is this. to fix the shearing valve pin tops, ball bearings, they changed the valve pin seat ring. Okay, you can see the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 to current. The Gen 2 is much taller than the Gen 1. And the theory behind that was that the Gen 2s would wind up pulling down the valve pin probably maybe a millimeter's worth of distance, reducing the amount of area that the bolt would actually contact to the top of the pin, reducing the chance of the valve pin ball bearing getting sheared off. Anyways, good improvements between generations for sure. What else was there? So these are the airway plugs that sit in your lower receiver beside your screw hole. I'm pretty sure if you've put on aftermarket grip on your marker, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This happens to be the first batch, because that's what I own. First batch, first gen T15 plug. You can see that one side's, it's made out of brass for one. It's totally different material. One side's smooth. One side has a small little pin that would sit in the airway itself just to help keep things aligned. Great idea. But these things were a real pain if you ever wanted to remove it. They did offer a grip airway option for a while, and you had to remove this guy to put that pipe in and the ASA through the grip. This was a pain to remove. So their fix for that was they changed the material of the plug itself. They put in a hole and tapped it and threaded it. So then that way, when it was sitting in your marker like this, if you wanted to remove this plug, you grab a small screw, screw it into the bottom, pull out the plug, easy peasy, right? Now, I'm pretty sure it's between Gen 2 and Gen 3 that this happened, but for a brief while, they were two different sized plugs. Okay, I'm pretty sure this happens to be the larger size. I thought I had a smaller size. I can't find it for the life of me. So, but I still want to make sure that you're aware of it. So if you happen to own a Gen 2 or Gen 3 T15 and you've lost your airway plug, just keep in mind, there are two different sizes. You might have a larger size like this, or the smaller size that was a couple millimeters at most, less in diameter. So if you lose it, just try to figure out if you have a larger or smaller plug. Yeah. All right, next. That's it for Gen 2. So let's go to Gen 3 to Gen 1. This is another significant change to the marker itself. Now you all know about the silver air chamber you have in the bottom of your lower receiver. Okay, I'll line these up just so you have a rough idea of what I'm talking about. In the Gen 1 markers, that silver air chamber, it had a air pathway that was cast into the aluminum during the manufacturing process. And that went from your ASA to the bottom part of the silver air chamber. The theory is great, but not every cast was perfect and not every cast was the same during manufacturing. And there wound up being issues with air leaks through the lower receiver. Well, there is no fix for that. The lower receiver, if it's leaking, I mean, if you can spot weld, good on you, but most people can't. It was garbage, all right? So the fix from First Strike was to redesign the air pathway. They created this air chamber. Here's the old one, just for comparison. Okay, almost the same. Just the newer one wound up having a sort of tail to it, and the purpose of that tail was to allow this sort of air pathway, it's like pipette, be able to get inserted from the backside of the ASA. So they removed the internal air pathway from the molding process and just put in a pipe, which was basically a direct fit, which, I mean, if you wind up getting a leak down here, it's really easy just to remove these two parts instead of throwing out the entire lower, I guess, right? Either way, a good improvement and better teching improvement, if you want my opinion, for that part. Well worth it. Another one of the changes, actually, I'll go to this guy first since it's associated. This plug. These are the two plugs that sit along with this screw that sit on your, let me see if I have that plate handy. This guy. They sit down here. All right. Since they removed the air pathway in the lower receiver, they no longer needed to have this plug actually plug up that air pathway, because in the older generation T15s, that's what that plug would do, right? And it's easily seen because this is the older generation plug, or Gen 1 plug. You can see the O-ring, and you can see the O-ring on the screw. So it actually physically acted as an airway plug, all right? But since they changed the air pathway in the Generation 3 and newer, well, they don't need this setup anymore. So they just went to a simple metal plug like that guy. Make a muck. All right. Lastly, for Generation 3, I'm pretty sure this is when they introduced longer screws for the plate that holds in the valve pin. Generation 1, Generation 2 used much shorter black screws. You were lucky to catch two or three threads out of it. And often if you were doing maintenance doing regular maintenance, some guys would over torque, and I mean, there's only 3 threads catching it. It got stripped, and that was not fun because, yeah, it made for headaches. So they wound up incorporating silver screws and longer silver screws to catch more thread. It's been, a thread saver since. All right. That's about it for Gen 3. Gen 4. Gen 4 is when they got rid of this guide bar and ASA ring that sat in the back of your marker to hold in your tank and your sock. They got rid of this and went to the sticky version. I don't have one. I can't show you what it is or what it's about, but at least you know about it. All right. Another change on the marker itself was they changed the charging handle. So previous gens from Gen 1, 2, and 3, you had a charging handle, you pull it, and you had to push it back in to lock it into place. Gen 4, they introduced a spring-loaded charging handle. Pretty simple mod. It was just a channel on top of the actual charging handle. They put a spring and then put a pin in the upper receiver, and there you go. Bada bing. It's spring-loaded charging handle. Retracted on its own. All right, next. Mag release button. The mag release button got changed. Actually, you know what? I'm pretty sure it wasn't the button itself. I'm pretty sure it was the hole on the marker got changed. So in Gen 1 to 3, it was a standard real steel AR type sized hole, and that wound up getting changed Gen 4 to newer to a tapered hole. So one side wound up being a little bit slimmer than the other, not allowing you to do a straight swap from real steel to a straight swap from real steel into your marker. You had to do a little bit of modding on your button itself for it to fit. Not a big mod. I mean, 30 seconds worth of grinding and you're good to go, but still, that's a mod that you have to do now. All right. Next up, your barrel D10 screws. Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4 and on. Biggest difference, the thread. This one's more coarse, this one's more fine. That's basically what it comes down to. All right, that difference. All right, spring. This is your spring for your nubbin on your selector switch. This is the spring that sits in your grip that pushes up on the nubbin to give your selector switch that little clicky feel, okay? The older gens used this guy. It was a wider spring itself. It often did not fit in any other aftermarket pistol grips. The grips themselves would have to have the hole widened a little bit with a drill. They've since changed that and introduced a longer, slimmer spring that will sit in here. It still makes everything nice and clicky. It just makes life a little bit easier if you want to swap out your grip. All right. You know what? I actually forgot one major thing from the Gen 1, Gen 2. The branding. Before I finish. The branding. So between Generation 1 and Generation 2, the company went through a rebranding and changed their name from Tiberius Arms to First Strike. Not much more to that. They just rebranded themselves. Totally forgot that. Can't believe that. Yeah. All right. So now that we're near the end of the video, and I forgot something for the beginning of the video, last change for Gen 5. And I'm sure there's probably a couple of little things in between that I either don't know of or have missed. I'm just doing the best I can with what I have. Gen 5 change that I've noticed so far is the bolt sleeve again. So not only am I under the impression that the little nub that pushes down on your mags to release the follower, I'm pretty sure this guy is a little bit more robust compared to other generations. It seems like it's sticking out a little bit more. But the bigger change is the screw hole access. The hole for access to your screw that holds your bolt sleeve now has a slot on it. If you can see that compared to other generations. Let's do this guy. All right, that slot is there to allow the drum mag / C mag to work with your T15. Now, don't ask me when it's coming out. I have no idea. All I know is that slot's there to allow the use of that drum mag / C mag. When it comes out, I don't know. And don't ask because I still don't know. All right, it's just there for that purpose. All right, I think I've covered most of it. Like I said before, I'm sure I've missed one or two things. There's got to be other stuff in there that's changed. Either I just don't remember or am unaware of it. But yeah, anyways, hopefully that helps you out in some shape or form. And if you have any questions, by all means, as always, post up, send a personal message, PM, and I will answer as best I can. All right, guys, hopefully that's it. Cheers.